What if a test for innocence became a tool for murder? In the ancient world, if you were thrown in a river and survived, you were innocent. By 1710, that logic had been turned on its head. To survive the water was to prove your guilt and earn a death sentence. This is the story of how that happened, and it begins with women like Dorka, who in that year was dragged from a funeral in her Hungarian village to face the river's judgment. A local nobleman, Andres Molnar, seized her by force, and after swimming her in the Tizar River, had her tied to a pole, scourged, and burnt alive. These brutal series of events, which occurred during the turmoil of Prince Frederick Rákóczi's insurrection, was not an isolated act of madness. It was the culmination of a ritual with a history stretching back thousands of years. The swimming of witches, a practice that seemed to belong to a dark and superstitious age, was in fact a procedure with a deep root in law, religion, and magic. It was a trial of life and death, a judgment delivered not by a court, but by the water itself. To understand how a nobleman could, with the force of custom behind him, torture and execute a woman in such a manner, we must trace the long and strange journey of the river ordeal. From the dawn of civilization in Mesopotamia to the witch panics of early modern Europe, this is the story of how a sacred test, once meant to reveal divine truth, became a tool of persecution and a desperate attempt to control the very forces of nature. The story begins in the Fertile Crescent of ancient Mesopotamia. The earliest known record of a trial by water comes from the Sumerian civilization. As far back as the 3rd millennium BC, under rulers like King Shirkuh I, the practice was later codified in one of the most famous legal texts in history, the Code of Hammurabi, the great king of Babylon. The procedure, known as the river ordeal, was reserved for the most serious accusations, especially those that were difficult to prove by other means: murder, adultery, and most importantly for our story, malign spells and sorcery. The logic of the Mesopotamian ordeal, however, was the precise opposite of the one that would later condemn Dorka. The Code of Hammurabi states, quote, "If anyone brings an accusation of sorcery against a man, and the accused goes to the river and leaps into the river, if he sinks in the river, his accuser shall take possession of his house. But if the river provides that the accused is not guilty and he escapes unhurt, then he who has brought the accusation shall be put to death." Here, sinking was a sign of guilt. Survival was proof of innocence. The river god was believed to pull the guilty down to their death, while releasing the innocent from its grasp. This form of trial was not unique to Babylon. It appears in the legal texts of the Hittites in Asia Minor, the Elamite Empire in Susa, and the Assyrian documents from as late as the 7th century BC. For nearly 2,000 years, across multiple civilizations, the river was seen as an arbiter of justice. Some scholars classify this type of ordeal as a direct punishment, a trial of life and death, where the verdict and the sentence were delivered in the same terrifying moment. It was a custom, the sources suggest, primarily for the common people, a form of justice that operated outside the literate elite. But why was the river chosen for this role? Rivers and canals in Mesopotamia were sacred places, sites for ritual cleansing and divine revelation. The ordeal tapped into the deep cultural reverence for water. An even more compelling theory connects the ordeal to another ancient and vital practice, rainmaking. Examining the biblical story of Prophet Elijah on Mount Carmel, where a trial by fire against the prophets of Baal is immediately followed by the end of a long drought. This suggests these ordeals were fundamentally linked to weather magic. In a world dependent on agriculture, where drought meant starvation, the power to control the weather was paramount. Those accused of sorcery were often blamed for blighting the land and holding back the rains. Subjecting them to an ordeal, therefore, could be seen as a ritual act to break the curse and restore balance to the natural world. This connection between the river ordeal and weather magic would lie dormant for centuries, only to re-emerge with terrifying force. But first, the ordeal had to be completely reinvented. How did a test where sinking meant guilt become one where floating condemned you? The answer lies not in the law, but in the transformation of faith itself, as the Christian church took an ancient pagan rite and gave it a new, deadly meaning. Between the 9th and 12th centuries, the liturgical trial by water became an accepted, if debated, part of ecclesiastical legal practice. The judgment no longer belonged to a river god, but to the Christian God, who would reveal the truth through a miracle. The logic of the ordeal, however, was now completely reversed. The writings of influential churchmen like Hincmar, the Archbishop of Reims in the 9th century, make the new theology clear. The procedure was exactly linked to the sacrament of baptism. A benediction reading during the trial stated, "If you are guilty of this thing, may the water which received you in baptism not receive you now. But if you are innocent, may the water which received you in baptism now receive you." Floating was the sign of guilt. The sacred water, the very water of baptism, was believed to reject the body of the sinner, the heretic, the witch. Sinking, being embraced by the water, signified innocence. Historians have shown that this liturgical ordeal was a widespread practice, used for a variety of offenses. It was a method for trying heretics, settling property disputes between nobles and abbots, and punishing common criminals for theft and murder. The laws of one check prince in the 11th century prescribed it for domestic disputes and murder. The famous assizes of Clarendon in 12th century England mentioned it as a standard procedure for robbery and other felonies. The trial itself became a highly ritualized affair. It often began with days of fasting and prayer. The accused would be brought to the church, where the priest would conduct a mass, consecrate the water, and perform rites of exorcism. The scene of the ordeal could be the church's baptismal font or a nearby river, which would be blessed and symbolically transferred into the River Jordan. Yet even within this official liturgical framework, the ordeal often ignited the passions of the public. In a case in France in the year 1114, an enraged mob seized several people suspected of heresy and subjected them to the water ordeal while the local bishops were still deliberating. The crowd, not waiting for the church's verdict, passed its own judgment. This foreshadowed the popular spontaneous justice that would characterize the later witch swimming episodes. By the 13th century, the official liturgical ordeal was in decline. The intellectual currents of the time, including the rise of scholastic philosophy and the reform of secular law, began to challenge the practice. Theologians grew uncomfortable with what they saw as tempting providence, demanding a miracle to solve a legal problem. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 officially forbade clergy from participating in ordeals. The official trial by water was dead, but an idea so powerful doesn't just disappear. It goes underground, into folk memory, waiting for a new crisis. And when Europe was gripped by the Great Witch Hunt, the forgotten rite would be brought back, not by the priests, but by the people, with the brutality the medieval world had rarely seen. The swimming of witches was not a direct continuation of the medieval liturgical rite, but its brutal, stripped-down descendant. It was a form of direct popular verdict, a folk memory of a legal custom now repurposed for a new, terrifying age. Intellectuals and demonologists of the era gave the practice a new veneer of legitimacy. Since the witches had renounced their baptism in the pact with the devil, the element of water would naturally reject them. King James I of England, in his influential 1597 book, Demonology, advocated for the ritual, giving it royal endorsement. The logic was simple and potent. The witch's body, possessed by demonic forces, was believed to be unnaturally light, and the sacred water of baptism would refuse to accept such a polluted vessel. The practice spread across the continent. The first documented cases of witch swimming appear in Germany in the 1580s, followed by the Spanish Netherlands and England. In Hungary, the first recorded instance comes in 1588, where a city treasurer noted a payment to, quote, gypsies to cast into water the woman from Montessor Street who was suspected of putting a spell on a little girl. Another early case, from 1597, reveals the popular demand for the ordeal. A man publicly shamed local magistrates for failing to punish two accused women by dunking them. The peak of the practice in Hungary and Transylvania occurred between 1690 and 1730, a period of intense social and political upheaval. The records from this area provide a chillingly detailed picture of the ordeal as it was carried out. It could be an official part of a trial or a spontaneous act of mob justice. It could be performed on a single individual or a group of accused witches simultaneously. A trial in Transylvania in 1678 illustrates the group swimming. 6 accused witches were thrown into the water. To provide a control for the experiment, officials threw in a man who had been sentenced to death for bigamy. The court record states that all 6 witches floated on the surface, while the man, despite being young, sank and had to be rescued by the executioners. The next day, the 6 women were burnt alive. The test had proven their guilt. In other cases, the ordeal was written directly into the verdict. In 1712, a woman named Anna Lazar was accused of shape-shifting into a hound. The court's verdict was explicit. The defendant shall be submitted to a water trial. If she goes down, let her be acquitted. But if she does not, let her be burnt alive. Here, the ancient trial of life and death was the sole determinant of her fate. Often the line between official procedure and popular lynching was blurred. In 1696, a witness named Ferenc Dezo testified about a swimming. He recounted how he himself had cast the accused woman into the water, and she did not sink, but she floated like a pumpkin. But officials from the nearby city of Szeged intervened and saved her from the fire. This case highlights the constant tension between the community's desires for immediate violent retribution and the attempts by higher authorities to maintain control over the legal process. Demonologists had their theory of baptism, and the magistrates had their laws. But for the common people of Hungary, suffering through years of devastating drought, the swimming of witches served a much older and more desperate purpose. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was a ritual to make the sky itself weep, connecting these early modern panics directly to the world of their most ancient ancestors. The early 18th century and Central and Eastern Europe was a time of ecological crisis. Historical records document extreme weather, devastating droughts, and widespread famine. In a society living on the edge of subsistence, the failure of the rains was a catastrophe. And in the popular mind, someone had to be responsible. Accusations that witches were stealing the rain and causing drought became increasingly common in the trial records of this period. In this context, the swimming of witches takes on a second, more ancient meaning. It was not just a trial, it was an act of sympathetic magic, a desperate ritual to end a drought and bring back the rain. A case from the village of Bud in 1708 provides the most explicit evidence for this interpretation. A witness, Sophia Tott, testified she had overheard a conversation during a time of great drought. Someone had remarked that some women should be swum, since there had been no rain. To this, the wife of Janos Kees replied that there was no need for swimming. If they simply stole the magic rod from the local shepherd, there would be rain on the 3rd day. This conversation explicitly linked the act of swimming women with the ritual of rainmaking. Throwing the witch, the accused cause of the drought, into the water was a symbolic act intended to break her power and release the life-giving rains. This suggests that the swimming of witches had 2 distinct, though overlapping meanings. In Western Europe, the practice was more closely tied to its theological roots in the medieval liturgical ordeal. The justification was primarily religious, the rejection of the witches by the water of baptism. The practice seems to be more powerfully driven by its connection to weather magic and collective crisis rites. The mass swimming of witches was more common in regions of Hungary that suffered from drought, while individual trials were more typical in the towns of Transylvania, which were more influenced by Western European legal patterns. The story of the river ordeal is a story of how a single ritual can travel through the millennia, changing its meaning and purpose to fit the anxieties of a new era. It began as a judgment delivered by a river god in a world concerned with cosmic order. It became a sacrament in a medieval world obsessed with divine truth and salvation. It was reborn as a brutal test in an early modern world gripped by a paranoid fear of the devil. And in the fields of the drought-stricken Hungary, it reverted to one of its most ancient functions, a desperate magical attempt to make it rain. The fate of Dorko Boda, dragged from a funeral and thrown in the Tisza River, was not simply the result of local superstition. It was the endpoint of a chain of belief that stretched back to Babylon. Her ordeal was at once a legal sentence, a theological proof, and a magical rite. In her death, we see the terrifying convergence of law, religion, and the unending human fear of a world beyond our control.